Hello and welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one-stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Paul Wagner, and it's just me in this intro today, but we had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Ryan DeLapp, and that name might sound familiar, and if so, you may have heard it before. This is our second time we've been able to have Ryan here on the show, and the first time it was talking about a journal article that he had written. And what's really cool is he's been able to take that article and he's turned it into a book. And so we were able to really talk about his new book that has released recently, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress, using coping skills from the REACH program to cope, heal, and thrive. And he does such a great job of making this information accessible and breaking it down for Ray and I as we're talking, and really kind of talking about the function and use of the book. So we hope you enjoy this episode. Please reach out on social media and we'd love to hear from you. And we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, supporting clients experiencing racial and cultural stress.
So Ryan, thanks for joining us again on Psyched to Practice.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back with you all.
Yeah, so this is, we're excited about having you. We think, kind of what we're going to talk about today is timely for a whole lot of reasons. But, I've been following your work now, kind of weird. It's like a few years, which is, and got excited to read your new book, which we're really going to hit today and, share with everyone. So congratulations on getting the book out.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a labor of love, one that took quite a while.
Yeah, it is a process, right? Yeah. So no, it was great. So so before we kind of really dive into the book, we know kind of our listeners know a little bit about you from you being on before. I guess maybe tell us a little bit what kind of led you into your work in the area of racial and cultural healing. How'd you get there?
That's a great question. I ask myself that a lot. How did that end up? I think as somebody who has a history of unfortunately being on the receiving end of some of these types of stresses, and I grew up in a family that talked a lot about how to navigate these experiences. It was something that was kind of interesting to choose to study because it was more so just a conversation within family. But ultimately, it was grad school. I worked with Dr. Monica Williams and Dr. Kevin Chapman in a Center for Mental Health Disparities at the University of Louisville. And we were looking at different factors that can influence how therapy looks for African Americans in terms of what their concerns are with walking into the door, and also factors that can exacerbate some of their symptoms. And for whatever reason, the experience of racial discrimination really spoke to me as something that I really wanted to better understand and assess. And that kind of piqued my interest probably back 2014 or so. And I've been doing this work ever since.
Yeah, wow. I kind of got introduced to your work when you were presenting about the REACH program, which I've used continually in my own practice. But what was the defining moment that helped shape your focus around the development of the REACH program?
So, one of the things that I realized that there's a difference between having an academic understanding of racism and all the factors that manifest around it, and the clinical application of the tools that we study. And so I realized in 2020, when I was working at Montefiore Medical Center in the child and adolescent outpatient department, and a lot of the teens at that time, had rightfully so questions and curiosities about the experience of racial and cultural stress. And I noticed that I felt insufficient in how I was conceptualizing and efficiently kind of identifying what it was that they wanted to talk about. And so the REACH program really began to be this curiosity of how can I more efficiently assess the needs of youth when they bring these topics up? And how can I make sure that I'm aligning my response with what evidence has suggested could be helpful in those moments? And that launched REACH as being a program that helps not just clinicians kind of do this work, but hopefully other professionals who are supporting youth as well. And ever since 2020, the program has kind of grown into what it is today.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that for me that really kind of attracted me to what you were doing is, I mean, we've all been through multicultural classes. We've all been, I always thought I learned interesting things, but I don't know that any of it ever made me a better clinician. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that, what really, I remember the first time I saw you at uh, with National Practice Conference, I think is when I saw you there. I think that's what hit me. And you used the word, kind of this integration of understanding that theory with what we already know clinically, this integration of DBT and CBT and how the skills that we have translate if we approach them differently. And I think that from my experience, what you've done with Reach has just taken all of that background knowledge that I've had and just lets me look at it a different way. So I mean, I really appreciate that the clinical application.
I think that's a piece that, and I appreciate that. I think for me, I wanted to find a way to help other clinicians lean into discomfort, right? So when I noticed that I was struggling to kind of hold space for these conversations, it required me to lean into that discomfort rather than run away from it.
Yeah.
It required me to, rely on the values that I have as a clinician and the principles rather than getting lost in the discomfort and like the inner kind of self-doubt that we sometimes have as clinicians. And I hopefully, like in all of my presentations and even in the book, my goal is to, call people into this conversation. And I think sometimes people disqualify themselves because they say, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to make somebody feel uncomfortable. I don't feel like I'm the right person for this conversation. And ultimately, those are, I think, excuses that can sometimes take people away from holding very meaningful spaces for folks. And to me, I think when you use language that's familiar to somebody and they don't have to learn a whole new lexicon, it helps them to step towards the discomfort rather than run away from it. And that's been a part of my mission in terms of helping, Black and brown individuals have more spaces where they can talk about these things, is by helping the clinicians that they see feel more comfortable holding that space.
And really, that practical element it's therapy for therapists in a way. It's allowing them to challenge some of the avoidance that they may feel, some of those automatic thoughts, and really giving them some of those tools and a path forward to really feel successful and really building that confidence so that they can do that same thing for those that they serve.
Yeah. I mean, many of the clinicians that I've had the good fortune of working with, number one is like, if we have a shared understanding, one, that racism exists, and unfortunately, that's a debate that is in our world right now. But if we have an understanding that racism exists and that it can be very harmful to the individuals on the receiving end, so if that prerequisite is already established, then I'm really excited to talk to any clinician to help them kind of use this work. I don't think this work can be applied if somebody doesn't check off those first two prerequisites. But if you do, I think, we can work through that anxiety and help you to kind of figure out what humility and curiosity and openness and sensitivity looks like as you apply some of these principles and these strategies that are in the Reach program and in this workbook. And so I love to kind of help meet people where they are in that discomfort, in that curiosity, and then helping them to feel like they can be effective in holding these conversations.
And I think you really just kind of answered it, but I do want to make sure that we're not missing anything with that. And I guess, with the book, and we should really kind of name the book, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress. I hear that desire to support clinicians and just kind of giving a method of bringing the academic understanding into the functional. Are there other motivations for you with writing the book? Or was that primary driving focus there?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a focus, which is understanding that, even though the work that I do is an adaptation or a translation of other interventions, sometimes the worksheets and the materials don't necessarily neatly align with how racial and cultural presents itself. And so the book includes, worksheets and language that allows clinicians not to have to figure out how to make that translational leap. It's like, this kind of looks, I mean, this client needs some sort of behavioral activation. Well, there's a worksheet in there that talks about behavioral activation, but applying it in the context of racial and cultural stress. And it's referred to in this book as filling your wellness buckets, right? Or if you're looking for ways to sensitively talk about assertiveness or assertive communication, but you also want to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes assertive communication can have its own negative impacts on the individual. Well, there's a whole chapter on helping you to sensitively broach that subject and also acknowledge the potential costs of that form of like standing up for yourself. And so I wanted to create a resource where clinicians didn't have to make so much of that internal decision making as to how do I make this evidence-based skill culturally sensitive to the person that I'm sitting across from. The second motivation was understanding that many people within the BIPOC community don't come to therapy. We see numbers increasing. We see more and more people seeing this as a resource. But at the same time, there are some youth who, may receive this information or receive this type of support at school, at community centers, within their families, within their friendships. And so I wanted the book to be written for them in their language, using language specifically for teenagers and young adults, so that if they picked up this book, they didn't have to say, oh, I got to do this with a clinician. And so that's the other motivation too, is to increase accessibility to this information as well.
And for you listening at home, I just have to say, like, worksheets, like it's while the information is there and kind of so informative, there's so much practical elements to it as well. And both giving functional examples of utilizing the worksheets as well as your own kind of space and kind of, so certainly that practical element just stands out there.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I guess as we're talking about racial and cultural stress, I'm really wanting to clarify what that means and what is your definition for our listeners at home? What is racial and cultural stress, and what are we talking about here?
So in the book, it really focuses in on combining those two kind of racial and cultural stress into what the book refers to as culturally stressful experiences or events. And it defines it as any instance where an individual, particularly a young person in this case, questions if they've been negatively judged or if they've been mistreated or denied an opportunity because of some aspect of their racial and cultural background. So this can include experiences that are maybe more commonplace, like being called a racial slur, being denied a job or a promotion, and the person is just questioning if it has something to do with their background. But this term also includes within group experiences. Fortunately, this book has allowed teens and this allowed young people to also acknowledge how the struggles of interacting with people within their community who have similar skin complexions or similar backgrounds, and how these judgments can include things like, oh, you're acting white, or you're not down enough, or you're just not accepted or respected as a member of your community for whatever reason. And that also can be culturally stressful, but sometimes doesn't fall within the category of racism in many people's minds. And so I wanted to create a term that was inclusive of moments when a young person's background or identity, particularly a racial and ethnic identity, feels implicated, and really provide resources for when those moments occur.
And, I'm so grateful that you're presenting that in that way, because it really does, it expands this net that we're casting, but it also can really, it makes that net a bit tighter, that we're really kind of catching everything as well, and trying to make sure that, everything that's functional and everything that falls within this, because there are elements that get left out or that fall behind. And I'm curious, you started naming some, but what are some of the common ways that, whether it's clinicians or with clinicians like working with clients, can identify some of those day-to-day experiences where these are happening to them?
I think that's a really great question. The book kind of breaks this down and uses like translational language to help the reader and clinicians have more familiarity with these experiences. So we know that racism presents itself interpersonally in your one-on-one or group-based exchanges with other people. In this book, I refer to it as relationship stressors. And I intentionally do that because I want to really get to the core of the interpersonal nature of it and help people to explore how that can look in their interactions. And so that can be anything from, as I mentioned before, a direct kind of slur or an accusation that, you are not included or less than, or that there's something about your presentation that is not a good representation of your community. It can even include sometimes within families where you have multi-generational families and the elders within that family are questioning your, the ways in which you honor tradition and being like, that's, you're not showing respect, or that's not how we do things. And for young people, that creates this really challenging experience of how do I navigate the stress of being who I am or who I'm discovering myself to be, while also honoring and trying to respect my family. And that unique stress is something I also wanted individuals to feel like they could come to this book for. On the flip side, community stressors is my kind of way of helping young people to understand that systemically the spaces that they navigate, their schools, their neighborhoods, the laws and policies within their kind of governments around them, they also can trickle down and have a meaningful impact on their day-to-day experiences, as we're seeing now, right? And sometimes it's really hard to pinpoint systemic racism, to say, oh, that's why I feel this way, is systemic racism. But for young people, I try to help them to see that as in their day to day, when they notice that there are certain resources or opportunities or sources of support that they wish they had, or that they see other people having that they don't, that could be a component of community stress that they may want to pause and navigate and learn how to cope with that experience. And so those are the two ways in which I try to break down this experience of of cultural stress into that relationship and community stressor framework. And the book starts off very early with helping readers to be able to understand which of these stressors they have experienced and that they're trying to use the book to cope with.
Yeah, I have to imagine that that is such a validating and potentially eye-opening experience as you're going through and helping to give a name to something that, the term racism, it can be so broad at times, and to really kind of narrow down, like, this experience can be related, and helping to really identify, especially on that community end that that you're discussing there, of like, I am like, this is something that's real that I'm experiencing, and it's not just, I'm making a big deal out of it, and really kind of internalizing some of those elements that really is an external influence over. And so to imagine that, those issues that you're working with here really feel seen and really feel heard. Again, going through the book, like that really comes off well, and I'm hopeful that it helps other clinicians bringing that in, helps others that are picking it up for themselves, like being able to recognize that for themselves. I'm wondering, when you're talking about the different ways that cultural stress manifests, what are some of the ways that the individuals might identify that stress within themselves? And when you're naming it, I have to imagine that they're already kind of noting that, and like that's what brings them into that conversation. But how can maybe someone who's really not attending to those experiences, what are the ways that that might manifest for them without really them recognizing it overtly?
So there's two ideas that I have there. One is, the book tries to expand what in literature they refer to as discrimination prototypes. And so the idea there is that if you are exposed to different examples of how this can look for other people, that they can then expand your consciousness and awareness of the ways in which these obstacles can come up in your environment. And oftentimes that is the benefit of being in community with people of a similar background, or even following people on social media or watching movies, is you get to get these exemplars of, oh, this is some of the operational kind of dynamics of the spaces that I'm in. And that can sometimes enhance awareness. But beyond that, I think, is the understanding that, we get this from some of the like stress and coping literature with like the appraisals and stress appraisals, is we understand that just because two people go through the same situation, it doesn't mean that they both walk away impacted the same way. And so this book tries to help young people not just get lost in the, oh, this has happened to me, but also this curiosity of, how has it affected me? Has it affected me?
Yeah.
And that's where I introduced kind of like the core skill of the beat, taking a beat. This has been like the acronym that has been my bread and butter for the past few years. It's very interesting that it seems simple enough to me that, but that is the thing that in the groups and the community talks, that's the acronym that people most acknowledge and walk away with. So I'll name it as, it's body sensations for B, E is emotions, A is action urges, T is thoughts. And so for our CBTers and, CBT third wave folks, like, we understand that as thoughts, feelings, and actions. But to have an acronym where you can pause in therapy and say, hey, can we just take a beat? And that's not just a pause prompt, but it's also a invitation to observe and describe internally what you're experiencing. That has been a really, really awesome tool to kind of orient my clients to, and even community members that I get to talk to. And the book essentially uses the beat diagram, or the taking a beat framework, to help the readers understand the different ways that racial and cultural stress can impact their lives.
It really is a great diagram that you that you have in the book, by the way. So not only worksheets, but it's great diagrams in there as well. And so we have kind of this identification, have the language to start kind of breaking down whether relational or if it's more the community focus there. You know, I, it makes me wonder, what are these ways that the stress shows up in individuals' lives? Like, what are the things that we're coming in with and we're talking about and identifying in
Mhm.
the therapy setting there? Or again, if they're like that, what are those things that are maybe driving individuals to come and pick up this book?
Great question. So that gets at like the three ways that this book talks about that your beat can look, right? And so when I'm working with folks, I talk about like you can, listen to a song and that song can have, be upbeat tempo, it can be slow, it can be smooth, right? But you want to listen and be able to distinguish the different beats because that's going to influence, your experience.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that, I talk about in this book in terms of how this type of stress can affect you is emotionally. I think that's probably the most clear cut and common explanation or complaint that people have is since experiencing these different experiences or the accumulation of these experiences, I felt off. Like I feel like physically more keyed up or more restless or more vigilant or alarmed. I feel worn down. I feel exhausted. I feel fatigued. Or emotionally, I feel a greater degree of anger, frustration, rage, sadness, all of these constellations of emotions. And the question is like, what do I do with all of this emotional discomfort? And so the book really has a whole section, a whole part that really talks about helping readers, not only understand and identify those emotional experiences, but it's also about like, how do you, practice self-compassion towards those experiences? How do you heal from those experiences? How do you make decisions in the midst of high stress and high emotional kind of moments? And that's one of the ways in which I really wanted readers to kind of understand that if you notice that you're experiencing a lot of emotional pain, there's a whole section for you to kind of really dive into navigating that experience.
Ryan, I want to kind of go maybe off course for a second.
Yeah, let's
So,
do it. Let's do it.
yeah. So, where Paul and I are located, we don't live in the most diverse communities. And, but we do have individuals who we see in practice who come from, very diverse backgrounds, but there's not a lot of community resources. And many of the teens that I work with, they then rely on online communities, whether that be through Instagram or TikTok or whatever they're using. Like that's where they're finding their support. And I find that there's both positives and negatives to that. Like they can go down a whole different path with maybe what seems to be supportive, but maybe not helpful. And then
Mm-hmm.
I think there's really some good communities that have really helped them connect with other individuals who are like-minded. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on like individuals in that position where they're trying to find other support, with similar, people with similar backgrounds. How do you navigate that with teens?
Well, I mean, I think first the question I ask folks is, especially if they're looking for virtual support, is I ask them to, if they're open to it, to pull out their phones and let's look at the people that they follow. And I'll ask them about, and I'm thinking of one particular client in particular, where I was like, how many people do you have that you follow that are from a similar background as you? And, because a part of that question is if you're looking at, glued to your phones every day, looking at cultural experiences that are maybe hard for you to relate to, or maybe standards that you're holding yourself to, but that don't really appreciate some of your cultural origins, that's going to influence your processing of who you are and also processing of like the stresses that's going on in the world. So a part of that is, of course, with the support of their family and also the consent by the teenager, is to really get a sense of like who might be some folks that you might want to follow who maybe are healthy, supportive, and like celebratory kind of folks for your cultural background. So that's one, is like leaning into that whole social media space and kind of also building up a list of like, is this person credible? One of the things in the book that, I talk about in the section on identity stress is building somewhat of a filter for the information around you and the messages that you're coming up with. And so that you're encountering. And so I want, if they're going to be consumers of the messages around them, specifically on social media, I also want to help them to kind of digest that material in a way that helps to protect them, as well as that helps them to see, oh man, this is somebody who is telling my story in a way that I align with, and that helps me to feel more proud and comfortable with who I am. And so really helping them and leaning into that social media world and helping them to just be more responsible consumers of that from an identity standpoint.
And to maybe take that a little bit further, I'm curious, like when you're talking about identifying those individuals that are going to be almost that guiding light and building that relationship, building that community, are there any like yellow flags or red flags that we as clinicians or that the clients themselves can be informed about that really can say, hey, this person's telling my story, but they might not be credible, or there might not then be that that positive influence that I really am looking for? And are there any of those maybe warning signs that we should be on the lookout for to really see, is this individual going to be, additive and restorative, or are they going to potentially be detrimental, or promoting ideas that are going to be harmful in the long term?
Great question. We could do a whole podcast on this. All right, so let me see. All right. So the first thing I start off with is, has the young person, within your work, taking the time to really talk about and begin the exploration process of who they are, right? So it's not going to these sources and saying, all right, tell me about who I am. It's more about like what self-exploration journey have they done apart from social media? So that's the first piece. And so that includes like conversations with family about, any types of like socialization that the family has done in terms of cultural events, cultural materials, conversations they've had to help the young person to really identify who they are, right? The other piece is really helping the young person to take some time and think about some of the core aspects of who they are. And then the book, offers the who am I diagram that kind of help readers organize some of their sense of self, whether that's their interests, their values, their strengths, and things along those lines. And so in my eyes, it's not going to social media to look for things to build you up. It's more so using some of the information you know about yourself to then go and kind of find things that align with some aspects of yourself, right? The second piece that I also look for is kind of, can the young to teen can we have a shared understanding of how they distinguish kind of affirming and positive social messaging from negative and critical social messaging? And so one of the things I'll talk about is like, if you see oftentimes on social media, there's a lot of humor that's used, right? And there's one particular social media video that I'm thinking about where it's a white identified kid and a black kid, and the black teenager is struggling to play basketball and can't hit a shot, and the white teen is really kind of trash talking and all of those things like that. And first I'm going to say, like, how do you experience this video? Like, what do you feel that this content is trying to communicate? Like, are there any stereotypes or any kind of things that that's being highlighted in this video? And then how are you kind of processing it? Is this something that feels affirming and supportive of people from your background, or is this something that feels kind of negative, critical, kind of like making a critique on the experience? And that's the first, just seeing how they process that experience. Yeah. What emotions does that bring up for you? What's the beat reaction to this content? Yeah. And then the last thing is, if you feel like any of this material feels really positive and affirming, let's talk about it. What is it that you feel like this video helps you to see? And maybe one person may say, well, it helps me as a black teen, feel valid that not every black person is an athlete. Not every black person is, supposed to know how to play basketball. And I actually feel like that's the message that I align with in this little clip. So okay, well, what are the things that you feel like are your interests that you're proud of that, doesn't keep in that box of athleticism? Then that now allows a great conversation to kind of go from there. Versus if this brings up pain and hurt, and it's like, man, it makes me think about the last time I was picked first in a pickup game, and I'm like not very good at sports. And it made me feel like really, pressure to be something that I'm not. Well, then how did you kind of process that experience? How do you process that pressure? How do we help that kind of experience not feel, we process the emotional discomfort, but we also at the same time help you to feel reinforced and affirmed in who you are? And so essentially this idea that I'm presenting here is, helping young people when they are kind of presented with social media content, not creating this dichotomy of who's good and who's bad, but more so saying, when you are exposed to content, how are you processing its relationship to your identity? How are you processing the ways in which it affects you emotionally? How are you processing the messages that you are identifying? And how are you guarding yourself from the messages that feel aversive? That's the framework that I think we as clinicians can really do to help youth to kind of think about more responsible consumption.
Yeah, and I love that because I think I think what you said, I think I find teens oftentimes they go into loving or hating the person. And I really love this idea of it's not really even about the person. It's what is your reaction to that content? How do we process it? No matter who, it can be someone who is famous and everyone knows about someone, who isn't. It's funny. I always, I love using pop culture and there's some who, I've found who are just wonderful. It's, Beyonce is one who comes to mind, although has gotten some bad press with that. Lizzo, I thought was always wonderful with like following her Instagram and, using that where I would say like, yeah, wow, when she says this, like, what's that reaction?
There you go.
And yeah, it is. I mean, I think that's such a great way to teach people. And, it extends not only with our topic about racial and cultural stress. I just think it's how to be a good consumer for everybody. How do we really make a decision to be intentional in what we let ourselves consume? I mean,
Absolutely.
if you feel bad about it, not worth doing. Yeah. So I love that. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets past also some of the like the blind allegiance, right? I grew up in the time of all the boy bands and girl bands. I mean, I guess that's still the case now, but you label yourself as whether you're part of the Bay Hive or you're
Right.
a part of the Swifties or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Which that then calls for this sense of like complete
Right.
and unfettered kind of allegiance to all content that this person puts out.
Yeah.
And the reality is that people are fallible. People sometimes miss the mark and misrepresent things. And so how do you kind of process the moment to moment rather than the general narrative that the kind of fan club is putting across? So like that's a part of this perspective as well, is like the moment to moment content can trigger different things, and how do we process that?
And I think you just gave a little clip that we should probably use for just how to process life, right? I just sat there thinking, like, gosh, we kind of are a society of that, right? Like, I mean, I think it's even what happens politics-wise that we don't judge the situation by situation. It's, well, I don't like them because they're this. I don't agree with them because they're that. Versus saying, there's good and bad decisions with everybody. And it's, I think, yeah. So that's going to be our clip. We're just going to take that clip and just be like, this is the message, right? We should really. Even Taylor Swift, I guess, makes mistakes, right? And we can process those and not have to agree. And I think that message could transcend to a whole lot of other content as well. But,
yeah, I mean, and I think that's the hard part is, when you're dealing with these like moment to moment experiences. And I think a part of this book's message is healing. Is because when you have moment to moment experiences, yes, it's like the isolation of what is the message in this moment, but then there's like the residual pain that kind of bleeds into the moment that you're also having to process. So like, it is like this very, even despite my best efforts to simplify a very complicated topic, it is this like very complicated, multifaceted experience, whereas the moment is definitely painful and hurtful, but also understanding the history and the narrative of what's attached to that moment also is helpful to process too. So a lot of this, even with politics, is understanding that too. Each of the figures that we uplift is understanding how the history meets the moment and creates the experience.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think just can use it in so many ways. Let's return back a little bit to the reach framework, and in what you use the term empowered coping. In there, and can you share a little bit about like what is empowered coping, and I guess how does it differ from just regular coping strategies?
Yeah, so this is a translation of a concept that was, I guess, described in a paper by doctors Rihanna Anderson and Howard Stevenson. And this topic, that they talk about is racial coping self-efficacy. And so we know self-efficacy as a concept that, if I go back to my history of psychology days, it's like, Albert Bandura did a lot of work on self-efficacy, right? And then even others looked at kind of when people are coping, right? A part of the coping experience is the evaluation of, did the strategies employed really alleviate and address the demands and the impact of the stress that you're with? And so racial coping self-efficacy is really honing in on this kind of sense of effectively navigating cultural stressors that are in your environment. And so the book kind of tries to take this convoluted kind of self-assessment and breaks it into 3 steps. And it essentially says, first step number 1 is how are you identifying the impacts of the stress you experience? So the stressful event. So the book breaks that into 3 categories. Are you experiencing emotional stress, which I talked about a little bit earlier? Are you experiencing identity stress, which is, man, this event is really making me think pretty negatively about myself and my background? Or is it affecting your sense of agency and your sense of control? Like, I really feel powerless right now. I don't know what to do to stand up against the community or relationship stressors I'm facing. And so when you're able to self-assess like the impact of this stressor, it then goes to step 2, which is, well, what do I have in my toolkit? And this book really tries to align both individual coping, such as like, what am I doing privately, with leaning into community resources and like, who in my environment do I trust to talk to and help me navigate this experience? And then step 3 is the implementation. So we've assessed the impact, we've identified skills and resources to lean on. Now it's time to put it into action and see how it takes effect. And so the book really builds around helping readers build the kind of small mechanisms for empowered coping, and then concludes with what I refer to as a sports guy, as a scrimmage, right? Which is taking all the drills that you do throughout the book and putting it into action in a scrimmage where you talk a little bit about a real-time experience you've had and all the different ways you've been impacted and how you distill down kind of what your primary coping response is going to be.
And I'm really grateful you used the word scrimmage there, because like the implication behind that is that it's, it's a refining process. We're taking it, we're applying it, and it can help to alleviate some of this pressure of, okay, I have it, I need to do it all right.
Hmm?
It's rather, where do I meet myself where I'm at? I have this understanding, but what is the actual, like, the conceptualization and the practical, like, implementation element of that look like? And really kind of balances that, like, those pieces out. And so I really appreciate how you broke it down into those steps, but just that word scrimmage just jumped out at me there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the points of feedback that I've gotten, which is, yes, the book breaks your experience down into like, well, if you're just having one of those 3 impacts, kind of how do you cope? But the common response is like, but what happens when all 3 are happening? And so a part of the scrimmage the scrimmage like metaphor is acknowledging like that in a scrimmage, you kind of have to sort through all this different information and figure out a step forward, but you also get feedback from your coach, right? And so this book also encourages people to kind of have coaches or navigators or people around them to kind of help them navigate the experience so they can go back and talk about like, what do you think about some of the ways I could have navigated this experience as well?
And when you're talking about like that, the importance of the feedback piece, I guess I want to jump back for a moment to our little side note where we were talking about the impact of social media. And I'm curious of how that happens when we're promoting or maybe even sharing some of those pieces that connect with us, but others might have that different interpretation or different experience, and how we can hold space for our own personal interpretations, and just the importance of bringing in a dialogue and starting to have conversations that aren't making it this all or nothing thought process. And it really reminds me, and Ray and I did an episode on the halftime show, and really just all of the different interpretations that were coming from Kendrick Lamar's performance and kind of what the meanings were, what the purpose behind it was. And there were some that felt pretty, pretty universal. It's like, okay, we hear this message, our own experience of that message might differ, but we hear the message. And then the different personalized like interpretations and the value of having others that we're sharing with that validate, but also the importance of advocacy. And I'm curious, like, in here, what role do you see advocacy for our own beliefs and sharing, but also advocacy in terms of a discussion? And where does that fall into in terms of empowered coping? Especially, my thought goes to the agency side of that. When it can feel like we are powerless or hopeless in that way, we can really work to create a greater sense of meaning and value in what we're doing. And what role do you see advocacy in challenging cultural stress?
So I think advocacy and even just the broader sense of community is key, right? Like, when you, even when I think about like the work of self-compassion and what doctors Kristen Neff and Germer talk about in terms of like the sense of common humanity and being connected to like a broader sense of like human experiences and human suffering, and being able to understand that like I'm not alone, like I'm not the only one who's ever encountered this. And at the same time, like these are the different ways that people process these shared experiences, right? I think community is really key for finding that sense of belonging and understanding. I also think that, before we kind of talk about advocacy, it's also talking about safety and thinking about like, how do we help young people and even ourselves think about the places that are most safe for us to do this open processing, right? To be able to process like a cultural moment like Kendrick Lamar and be able to say, you know what, like I am okay with somebody having a different opinion because I can appreciate at their core, their values are they're coming from a place that is safe and that I can vibe with, even if the like specific words they're saying are different than my own. And so I think that's a part of this piece that, when we're thinking about advocacy is like helping ourselves or even the people we're supporting think carefully about like the people around them that they can trust, right? To lean on, to be able to, in the case of agency stress, utilize their influence or their privilege to speak on one's behalf or to support one in their fight for change. But in a broader context, when we're having conversations about just cultural events, the people who we feel like, number one, we can keep it real with because we know that they are respectful and that they create that validating space. But on the other side, that people who, we just also trust kind of have a culturally sensitive way of like approaching the world. And I think that's really important when you're kind of selecting your community to process things with. And the book definitely helps with that with worksheets because as you said, worksheets. So if there's a question, if there's like building community, there's worksheets for helping with that too. So all for that.
And this, as you just use that, like the cultural sensitivity and the importance of that. And it just made me think about how different that is versus the cultural silence. And especially when there can be discomfort in approaching these topics and really starting a dialogue, especially if it feels like there's not, there isn't this knowledge base. And, back to one of your earliest comments here, it was, as long as these prerequisites are met where there's a shared understanding and this desire to learn, you're open to this conversation, really kind of excited for this conversation. I guess, what are the challenges that you see clinicians who maybe don't feel comfortable approaching that, or maybe there is this lack of confidence or a lack of experience, or even speak from my own case, but Ray kind of called out our environment really doesn't have a great deal of diversity within it. Like, what are those ways that we can start these conversations, especially if there's a worry of I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to do the wrong thing, I'm going to come off the wrong way, so I'd rather not say anything. And how do we challenge that?
Yeah. Well, number one, it's, exactly what you all are doing right now, which is like aligning yourself or finding people who, are open to having these conversations, consenting to having these conversations and leaning into the discussion, like, maybe fumbling over your words or asking questions about like, hey, I'm curious how you would, I know I just kind of asked this question, but is there a different way that you think would have been a little bit more palatable or, more accepting? And so actually this kind of goes back to a paper that my wife and I, who's a psychologist as well, put out a couple of years ago about helping clinicians to prepare for conversations related to race and culture. And a part of that paper we talked about is, engaging in conversations outside of your therapy sessions. And so that may include building a virtual network, right? Which is something that I've been a part of for a couple of years with people who aren't in my direct community, but who are consenting to say like, you know what, having these conversations about the stuff that is happening in the world is very important and enough for us to protect a time once a month to talk about. And in those conversations, you create a space of building confidence and comfort with asking questions, holding space for somebody else's feelings, validating the responses that they are saying, acknowledging some of the like shortcomings and blind spots that you have. It's learning apart from the care that you're providing. And then I also think can't really kind of can't say this enough about just self-education with reading, watching, listening, which is why I really appreciate you all giving me this platform to hopefully be kind of, something that helps people broach this subject in the spaces that they're in. And so, and then the last thing and I got this from some of the work of Dr. Monica Williams and a paper where I think she talks, the title is Being an Anti-Racist Clinician, is, going into places where you are a cultural minority so that you can also have a little bit of that experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean being a racial minority. It can be a space where you don't know the traditions and the customs and the language, and you feel othered, and sitting in that experience, embracing that experience. Maybe it's not a one-to-one, but at least it gives you a little bit more empathy or capacity to have empathy for how these experiences can happen for folks who are maybe more regularly in a minority or marginalized space. And so that's another thing that I would also suggest.
Yeah, and I think the couple of things that you kind of said to just kind of summarize. I think for me, it's always been curiosity. I mean, I think that you just don't know that you can go wrong when you're curious about other people's reactions. And I think also the idea of accepting that we're fallible. You know, I mean, and I tell people all the time, I mean, listen, I'm an old guy. I work with teenagers. We are very different. So I'm going to probably say something that's you don't like, and that's okay. Like, let's build a space that you can call me out, and I'm not offended by that. That call out's more curious. And I think it goes both ways. Like, I mean, I can call them out the same way. And I think that's that idea of mutual respect, it comes from being okay with making mistakes. I mean, I've had many cultural faux pas in my life, but they made me better. They made me where I learned so much more. And I think we could just do that so much. I mean, just from the
Agreed.
experience, but just like I said, just the curiosity. It was Paul and I had our, he mentioned the Kendrick Lamar thing. A little bit of a debate of, okay, here's two white guys going to tackle our interpretation of this, and how does that come across? Is there are people going to take that wrong? Like, that's something that is something we have to we kind of kept in mind, but the message and the curiosity of our experience we thought was worth it.
Yes.
So I appreciate that you
Yeah, no.
kind of hit those points.
And I think the point that you also mentioned is there's the openness and curiosity as like the pre kind of like mindset, but then there's also the openness and curiosity about the impact of your efforts, and the openness to kind of revise and listen and not get kind of caught up in like the labels that can be associated with the actions that you took. And I think that sometimes, I think about the intent versus impact framework, right? And I think sometimes the best intentions, people get stop there,
right,
and don't kind of also show the same type of respect and intrigue and interest in, let me also be open to the impact of my actions, even if they were good and well intended. So I appreciate you also acknowledging that, because that's not just for white clinicians, that's for all clinicians, right?
Yeah. Right. But I mean, it does, and it does create, even further dialogue. I mean, I will say I've probably had more people approach me about our Kendrick Lamar conversation than I have over topics that I thought, wow, this is really great. Like that, whether they loved it or hated it, it created conversation. And I think we just miss that so much in the world of being able to, like, the best conversation I had from it, I won't get into all the details, but was somebody was really upset that I did it. They were like, how could you do an episode talking about that? And it was a fairly, and it was a personal friend, not somebody professional, but was like, we sat down and had a great conversation. And at the end, it led to such a great outcome. But we're all, I think if we fear that, we miss great opportunities.
Wholeheartedly agree.
And I want to even just kind of call, like, leading up to this conversation, I'm really excited. Ryan, not our first time interacting, and as we're preparing, if I was taking a beat, there was tension in my chest. There's like, okay, we're talking about, and I found myself like, okay, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I say something that's offensive? And I love that that's the point of this conversation, is to bring awareness. And and you caught out a really important piece of that. It's a consenting in the conversation. We're not just going to kind of go in and have an assumed consent, making sure that there's this acknowledgement. But when there is, it creates a space for vulnerability. It creates a space for kind of a validation of that discomfort, while also acknowledging the importance and significance of challenging it. Because that's then, if we don't, that's what leads to the avoidance, and that's what just continues the cycle that has clinicians not talking about this in session, and has them not asking hard questions that they might say the wrong thing. But also, I think it was one of your one of your gems last time, but instead of in here, of the importance of putting yourself in that environment where you are experienced as the other or the minority, and really, again, gaining differing perspectives and being open to that. And, I don't know that I could really summarize one takeaway. I could, everyone has to listen to the entirety of the episode because there's so many different elements because it's a complex concern. It's complex. And, I think, in the book, you do a phenomenal job of taking it, acknowledging the complexities, breaking it down and working to make it practical, but it still maintains that it's a complex, practical approach, but it's complex because it works to address, again, the various ways it shows up.
Yes, agreed. I mean, so many things to say in response to that. Number one, the first thing is, we got to practice what we preach as clinicians. And, we ask our clients to do a lot of things that cause uncomfortable beats for them and for them to kind of lean into their values, stay the course, and come out on this other side. We debrief their learning. We got to be doing the same things when it comes to some of the topics that really align with our values, and hopefully conversations related to someone's background and the stresses that they feel related to their background aligns with your values as a clinician. And so I really, really hope that. And I really appreciate also just this opportunity to talk about this topic. And I think in a what do I call it? 3-point, 5-point takeaway kind of culture that we're in, and every kind of mental health, 3 things you need to know about X, Y, or Z, right? And that type of culture, I definitely felt like that pressure when writing this book, but also wanted to kind of respect the integrity of how complex this conversation is. And I appreciate you acknowledging the balance that I struck with that.
And, Ryan, we've mentioned the worksheet, and all these activities in your book. I guess I'm curious, is there a favorite one that you have? Is there kind of a part of the book that you're kind of like, this is the definite checkout? What would you pull out of the book as your favorites?
I mean, I think at the very beginning, it's the relationship and community map. I think that at the very beginning is really key because this book, I didn't want it to just be about all the stress and the pain that somebody experiences. That exercise helps teens look at the people around them and the places that they spend their time in and acknowledge, yes, there can be stress in these places and around these relationships, but let's also celebrate the strength and the resources that it offered to me within my map. And so that's one worksheet I really love to get the chance to do with folks. Also really love the beat diagram because by all means, it speaks volumes in terms of its application. And then the last but not least, it's the who am I diagram as well. I get a chance to go into a community and ask kids, do you think thinking about the question, who am I, is important? And I tend to get, more greater than 50% of the kids will be like, I think it's an important thing to think about. And then I ask them, well, how do you go about answering that question? And the hands go down. Even though it's a 3-word question, it's a very hard question to sometimes know how to concretely do. And so I love that this book offers some concrete resources to kind of help people start that conversation with themselves. And so that's another exercise or handout that I love.
Yeah. Well, the beat one, like you said, that's been the bread and butter. Like that as well. I thought it was really great. And the who am I piece of it. I just so much value in it. I oftentimes in supervision say, tell me about the kid first, and then we'll talk about their problems. Like, let's just kind of understand who they are. And it's just such a valuable piece to get their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I've done that for years. I think reading the book, it's given me a way to revise it for all clients. I mean, I think everybody I see, it's now just a new way for me, even adults. Like now it's like, okay, this is a different way for me to maybe ask some questions to really know the person first.
Yes.
And it's just such an important piece. And that's a great diagram, but
Thank you.
Is my favorite. That's the one.
I think the other piece, if I can just also emphasize that I think there's a lot of information, but one of the things that I think is also a big piece of this book is choose your own adventure, right? And so to me, I think this book isn't a cover to cover read. It's a read the first portion of it, figure out which sections after that are helpful for the moment you're in, put it down, come back, in the future, right? It's iterative process. And that's how I wrote the book, to think about this as a tool that, can serve as kids are going through college and they're kind of navigating the years and the different experiences they go through there. High school students are kind of going through that material. If you're going into the corporate world and you're kind of trying to also think through like the different experiences that you come across in that space, it's really thinking about this as like a tool that can stand the test of time and kind of keep coming back to, and you just pick the part you need in the moment and come back later. So that's also what I hope people can use it for.
Absolutely. Great. Well, Ryan, we could probably spend all day talking to you, but we want to respect your time.
Absolutely.
So, as you've experienced with us before, we like to kind of wrap up with a few takeaways. And, so first takeaway is, if you could recommend one piece of content, book, movie, podcast, anything comes to mind for those in the profession that you think kind of aligns with your work, what would it be?
I think there's a TV show series called All American and All American Homecoming that is on Netflix. And I think especially when I do kind of community-based work and I'm looking for clips of things that kind of showcase different types of stressors that I talk about in this book, I think that series, number one, it's just a great series. It's very engaging, but it also talks a lot about the different ways that racial and cultural stress can show up, at least in the Black experience.
Yeah.
And so if you're looking for kind of more firsthand orientation to some of this material and how it can show up, and even just the celebration of community and how community can be a helpful way of navigating tough cultural moments, the All American and All American Homecoming, they're two separate series, but they're related. One's a spinoff of the other, would be a really great two shows to check out.
Awesome. And then lastly, as you mentioned, we're kind of in the takeaway phase of what are the gems that everybody has to summarize to, right? So what are kind of your 3 gems or takeaways from kind of this content you would want people to have?
I guess number one is this conversation matters. I know there's a lot of regulations for some of your listeners about when and how and what can be talked about in these conversations. But just because there are those barriers, it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. And so that's the first one is, having these conversations matters. I'd love to see when clients realize that this can be a part of their care, right? That we can have these discussions and talk about this. Number 2 is learn to listen to your clients' beats, right? Whenever they bring up a cultural event that's happening, even if your clients don't look and appear to be a person of color, there's a lot of folks who are talking about the political climate. When I listen to them talk about how it affects them emotionally or physically or their thought process, sometimes it does align with the 3 ways this book talks about. And it does allow us to take a pit stop from just focusing on symptoms and to be responsive to the specific things that they're struggling with. And then the third thing is lean into your strengths as a clinician. I know this is a topic that can feel new and kind of a little unfamiliar, but some clinicians are really great with, just leaning into curiosity and being empathetic. Some are really good with like the conceptual framework, and some are really good with the DBT skills and the CBT skills. Like whatever your skills are as a clinician, I think you can take those skills and still be very effective in this conversation, as long as you said earlier, Ray, it's rooted in openness, curiosity, and humility. And so my hope is that, this book helps folks to do those 3 things. Start the conversation, understand the conversation and what mechanisms are happening in it, and feel effective in how they support people.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And, thank you for your book and what you have shared. And, I'll also kind of plug, you and Selena did a chapter for our book on CBT in schools, which I love that chapter and directly how it relates to those working in a public school setting. So, seeing what you wrote there and then now seeing the expanded manual of it really ties everything together.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you for your time, and always just a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you all for this platform. And, for all the listeners, check me out on LinkedIn, Ryan DeLapp. You can also check me out on X at Dr. DeLapp, PhD. And then also, if you are someone who's interested in learning more about the REACH program and all of its resources, you can Google REACH program at Ross Center, and hopefully there's a link to that folks can just kind of go straight to. I offer trainings to organizations, community members. I also love to train people to facilitate groups that are rooted in this book. And then also soon we will be offering groups for residents of the DMV, so DC, Maryland, Virginia, and New York. And so if any of that kind of sounds like something you'd be interested in learning more about, check us out. I'd love to schedule a call and talk to you about the possibilities.
Noted there will certainly be a link in the show notes, as well as if you see in our social media, there'll be a link for it there as well. So yeah, we'll certainly want to spread the message. And if you're a licensed clinician who would like to use this information in your practice, please visit www.psychedpractice.com or check the show notes for a link. So take a look at our CEU exam for this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well, stay psyched.